So first I'll look at Canada Park, a video by the Montreal-based Palestinian artist Razan AlSalah, which uses Google Earth software to visit the Israeli touristic park built on the site of 3 destroyed Palestinian villages. And then I'll examine at those terrifying frontiers where the existence and disappearance of people fade into each other, a video made in response to Gaza's Great March of Return and to Edward Said's book After the Last Guy by the Palestinian artists Basel, Abbas, and Ruanne Abou-Rahme, who live between New York and the occupied West Bank. But before speaking in depth about these 2 videos, I'm going to begin by addressing the virtual as a mode of experiencing Palestine and other places from a distance in digital mapping platforms, interactive documentaries, virtual tours, and indeed virtual reality, as well as less sort of less digital media in literature, in film briefly as well. I'll also elaborate on return as something that Palestinians have both been imagining and enacting in the 75 years since the start of the Nakba. And this sense of return as not only a right, but crucially a practice, I'll say, informs my use of the virtual as much as contemporary media technologies, because practices of return are, I think, virtual prefigurations of a politics to come, or in other words, the kinds of seeds of decolonization. But this is maybe underdeveloped, I think, in this talk, so I'd be happy to discuss this in our conversation afterwards. I'm going to share my presentation now, and at a couple moments, maybe somewhat awkwardly toggle to videos. I'll play clips of each of the 2 videos that I'm going to discuss. Yeah, so I'll get into it here. I don't have time to discuss this anthology that many of you likely know, but I just want to mention that some of the short stories in Palestine Plus 100 feature stories about sort of various forms of virtual return. These include one that is about sort of piercing kind of Matrix-like scenario, a veil of virtual peace in Palestine, Israel, to return to a still suffering Gaza. That's in Salim Haddad's story. Or hacking media infrastructures to re-Arabize spaces within historic Palestine while establishing a Palestinian government in waiting via diaspora gamers in Imad ad-Din Aisha's story, or shuttling between the parallel worlds of Palestine and Israel, in which the same cities exist under different names in Majid Kayal's stories. So in recent years, a variety of digital mapping platforms, interactive documentaries, virtual tours, and new media artworks have staged spatiotemporal returns to and of Palestine, opening portals to the land and to the repressed past that is present of the ongoing Nakba. Take, for example, the palimpsestic Palestine Open Maps, which digitally overlays maps of Palestine from the 1870s, 1940s, 1950s, and the present to create open source searchable versions with which users can interact. Similarly, there's Zochrot's iNakba, an app that maps the hundreds of Palestinian villages destroyed to create Israel, incorporating user-generated images and histories on an interactive map of present-day Israel. Or consider the interactive documentary Jerusalem We Are Here, directed by Dorit Naaman, which invites web users to tour the contemporary Kadamon neighborhood of Jerusalem, guided by the director herself, as well as Palestinian researchers Anwar Ben Badis and Mona Hajar Halabi, to look at the neighborhood prior to the 1948 expulsion of Palestinians and other non-Jewish Jerusalemites. And live virtual tours of Jerusalem are offered by the Palestinian civil society organization Grassroots Al-Quds, which since the start of the COVID pandemic has complemented its on-the-ground tours with online tours for people around the world to learn about Palestinian experiences of Jerusalem and Israeli policies designed to displace them from the city. These projects use digital media tools to excavate histories hidden by Israeli settler colonialism while offering, quote, virtual transportations for Palestinians unable to travel due to Israeli restrictions, unquote, as Dale Hudson writes of I Nakba and Jerusalem We Are Here. Here, I explore a similar notion of virtual returns in the two digital video works I've mentioned, Basel Abbas and Ruanne Abou-Rahme's At Those Terrifying Frontiers, made in 2019, and Razan AlSalah's Canada Park, made in 2020. Amplifying recent marches of return undertaken by Palestinians as acts of commemoration and protest, these videos perform virtual returns by digitally accessing land from which the artists are separated. Importantly, they do not enact virtual returns in opposition to real returns. Rather, they use digital media to explore imaginaries and acts of return that are rooted in offline political practice. The artist's insistence on tethering the possibilities afforded by digital media to the material realities of settler colonialism and anti-colonial resistance distinguish their engagement with the virtual from VR projects that address political conflict through frameworks of humanitarianism and empathy. Contemporary discourse surrounding VR stresses the technology's allegedly unprecedented capacity to transport its users to distant places and immerse them in ultra-realistic surroundings. Given these qualities, it should be no surprise that VR has been employed increasingly by humanitarian organizations, activists, and journalists in their efforts to stimulate empathy by bringing people into startling proximity with war-torn cities, refugee camps, or impoverished and disaster-stricken rural areas. In a decade that witnessed both the rapid development of VR and a devastating war in Syria, multiple agencies from the International Committee of the Red Cross to the New York Times have created VR stories that simulate Syrian experiences of urban warfare, perilous migration, and adjustment to life as a refugee, perhaps the best known being the ICRC's The Right Choice, made a few years ago. Liberal values of empathy and understanding are the stated aim of many humanitarian VR documentaries, but their emphasis on the exposure of unfamiliar victims in distant sites of conflict is ethically and politically troubling, particularly when considering who has access to VR today. Media scholars such as Sasha Crawford Holland and Mariam Kamil have each noted the resonance between humanitarian VR documentaries and travelogues from an earlier era of imperialism. As Crawford Holland writes, humanitarian VR recalls popular elements of the early 20th century, quote, cinema of attractions that stand as, quote, symbols of epistemic might through which viewers traversed space and time and gained omniscient access to the colonized other, unquote. One of the key ethical issues with humanitarian VR could be summarized with the phrase access without accountability, which I borrow from the scholar Sabrian Emrov describing a VR installation by the Israeli artist Daniel Landau that immersed museum goers in the virtual living rooms of two families, one, quote, Jewish and one, quote, Arab, and the project's text notes, using virtual reality glasses, you are able to, quote, meet members of both families from up close and hear from them about what connects and divides them, as in this image in the Israel Museum, of course, located in Jerusalem. If immersion or access without the possibility of accountability is uncritically championed in much humanitarian or liberal VR discourse, it's closely intertwined with the portmanteau concept of immediation, which has been explored independently and influentially by both the anthropologist Laurie Allen as well as the media theorist Pooja Rangan. I call upon immediation as a concept here as a critique of humanitarian media that conceal the means by which catastrophes are produced and reproduced in order to elicit shock and sympathy from relatively privileged spectators. Through such concealment, the figure of the human, or the human victim, emerges at the same time as political actors and structures of violence recede. In the context of Palestine, Laurie Allen argues, immediation names a post-Oslo constellation of human rights, visuality, and affect that Palestinian activists and international NGOs alike engage in a global contest for sympathy, wherein, quote, Visual proof of damaged bodies and images of human suffering emerge as primary tools, unquote. Such media aim to impact spectators at a visceral level, compelling a sense of compassion for a victim, perceived beyond any specificity as human, that provokes action. Immediation frames Palestinians, as Allen puts it, within the subjective role of the, quote, sympathy-deserving, suffering human. In other words, Palestinians are reduced to what Ariella Aisha Azoulay elsewhere calls visible victims, exposed to the gaze of a distant spectator who is made to look away from perpetrators and to disassociate their actions and the regime under which they act from the violence that makes victims. AlSalah and Abbas and Abou-Rahme's videos are significant as practices that rehearse ways of sensing Palestine and Palestinians otherwise. Unlike VR works that strive for immersion, they emphasize cuts and glitches, foregrounding and disrupting processes of mediation precisely to highlight the inability of virtual returns to substitute for real returns, of Palestinian refugees to their land, of expropriated lands to Palestinians, and of the right to build and forage on land to those living under Israeli colonial rule. Notably, they also operate at more poetic and affective registers than the largely expository new media works aimed at raising awareness among Israeli and international publics. Rather than uncover realities that should already be evident or seamlessly transport audiences into an immersive environment, the videos considered here act as opaque portals to a potential Palestine, performing return as an ongoing possibility while maintaining a representational unknowability and impasse that can only be overcome through material, collective acts of decolonization. At the same time as I highlight the impact of interactive digital media on imaginaries and practices of return, I want to foreground the fact that Palestinians, like other exiled people, have long enacted virtual returns without the use of digital media. If we consider the virtual as a space of potential, unmoored from virtual reality technologies per se, we understand imaginative and practical modes in which Palestinians have been continually performing return since the moment of their exile. What's today called telepresence, and here I have a very good book, I think, on the subject of telepresence and just a creepy stock photo that may illustrate one of its modes. So action at a distance of the sort that we're accustomed to in the age of remote work and remote war, an era of drone warfare, telehealth visits, Zoom meetings, has long been foreshadowed by the cognitive condition of diaspora, of living both here and there at once. The importance of rehearsing return can be seen in the centrality of return to Palestinian cultural production ever since the Nakba. Razan Kanafani's 1969 novella Ad ila Haifa, or Returning to Haifa, is probably the most well-known Palestinian narrative of return, a landmark of committed literature that sensitively depicts both the tragedy of the Nakba and the necessity of revolutionary struggle. Notably, Return to Haifa represents return as simultaneously temporal and spatial, with the characters' return from Ramallah to the Haifa home from which they were forced to flee also necessitating a return to 1948, which Kanafani renders through flashbacks. Kanafani narrates a concrete spatial return to a house expropriated by the Israeli state, but also a dream of returning home in which, quote, the homeland is the future. The 2008 film Salt of the Sea, directed by Anne-Marie Jasser, echoes Kanafani's novella in a pivotal scene in which a young Palestinian-American woman, played by poet Suhair Hamad, enters the Jaffa home that belonged to her grandfather and demands that the young Israeli woman living there recognize it as stolen. But it is Jasser's subsequent film, When I Saw You, that conveys the exhilarating and unresolved potential of return, with its final scene of a young boy and his mother running back home that ends in a freeze frame before they reach the perilous guarded fence separating Jordan from occupied Palestinian land. Alongside these examples in cinema and literature, one might think of Emily Jasser's celebrated photo and text series, Where We Come From, it's unfortunately a little bit small, so I'm not sure how much you can see of the text here. This was from 2001 to 2003, this series of work, where Jasser, who is incidentally Anne-Marie's sister, and they run the space Dar Jasser together in Bethlehem. Jasser, who holds a US passport, asked Palestinians forbidden from accessing different parts of Palestine, depending on, of course, the ID cards that they hold, "If I could do anything for you anywhere in Palestine, what would it be?" So the artist visited a woman's Jerusalem grave for her son with a West Bank ID in Bethlehem, took a photograph of a Jaffa home for a refugee whose family was expelled in 48, and played soccer on the streets of Haifa for the son of exiles from that city, among other actions that she documented. In evoking such rehearsals, it's important to emphasize that Palestinian refugees have not only imagined and demanded, but again, indeed practiced various forms of return ever since 48. I think I meant to, well, I'll leave this one up. Immediately following the Nakba, tens of thousands of Palestinians, labeled infiltrators by Israeli authorities, walked back to their villages across newly divided lands. This war on return, as historian Shira Robinson recodes David Ben-Gurion's war on infiltration, entailed both the deportation or execution of returnees and regular raids on Galilee villages to root out Palestinians without state-issued ID cards. In 1949, Robinson writes, quote, "An average of 1,000 refugees crossed into Israel each month, a flow that continued even after a free fire policy issued in April 1949 turned the country's truce lines into killing fields that left 1,000 dead by the end of that year," unquote. Importantly, Robinson calls attention to the failures of these military operations. As protests against Israel's border policies, led by Galilee clergy members and communist politicians, mounted, expelled Palestinians continued to reunite with family members, hiding in what were called, quote, underground railroad stations. Return is not only a dream, but also a dangerous, even deadly act of defiance. Return, therefore, depends on collective vision and solidarity. Today, Palestinians are frequently inspired by refusals performed by each other across the borders and political fragmentations imposed by Israel. In the artist Ruanne Abou-Rahme's view, then, Gaza's Great March of Return was in part, quote, an answer to the marches of return that young people had been doing to the sites inside 48 at that point for years in a large-scale way, unquote. Many such examples exist. In the summer of 2012, and now this image is appropriate, a small group of Palestinians whose grandparents were displaced from Ikrit decided to return to the depopulated Galilee village in a sustained way after many years of meeting there for annual summer camps, weddings, and burials. Creating the Ikrit Community Association, they publicly asserted their history and right to return, inspiring other 48 Palestinians to follow suit. 2013 saw a summer of return during which descendants of Palestinians displaced from the villages of Kafr Birim, Ghabsiya, Safuriya, Miyar, Malul, and Lajun participated in the Adna, Our Return project, which, quote, aims to educate the new generation with family connections to these villages of their history and rights, with film screenings and storytelling featuring residents who survived the expulsion, end quote. As members of the Our Return project returned to their villages, they projected possible futures of return, both materially and virtually, building on-the-ground structures and also producing digital renderings of villages to which Palestinians had returned en masse. Israel demolished the new structures that these young returnees built, but this only strengthened the latter's conviction that their resistance was part of a long history of refusing settler colonial authority. Moreover, the media produced by Adna endures as concrete documents of return, past, present, and future. Their efforts are testament to, quote, how return to Palestine is both a virtual, imagined future and a planned, substantive present. So to turn now to one of the videos, in Canada Park, Razan AlSalah narrates a virtual excursion to the video essays titular site, an Israeli national park built on the land of Palestinian villages near Jerusalem that the Israeli army destroyed in 1967. A touristic area in which Israelis regularly hike, picnic, and take historical tours, Canada Park becomes, in AlSalah's virtual visit, a site of radical haunting. The artist layers glitchy moving images from Google Earth with photographs of a return march undertaken by Palestinians to the destroyed villages over electronic music and sonic manipulations of her spoken narration that establish an uncanny balance between the familiar and the otherworldly. AlSalah's voiceover, distanced and distorted by heavy reverb, poetically evokes the sensory disorientation that the video performs, as she intones early on in a formal Arabic that is loosely translated in the English subtitles, "My eye has no iris, my eye is a glass prism." Opening with this first-person declaration of a fantastically defamiliarized organ of sight, lacking that which controls the flow of light and breaking apart all the light that flows through it, AlSalah both undermines the idea of a neutral technology of vision and proposes a potent mode of perceiving otherwise. Even as it employs Google's mapping software to visualize a virtual return to Palestine, then, Canada Park suggests that it is a decolonial, surrealist eye, or eye, that in both senses of the word, that can see Palestine, past, present, and potential, beneath the pine trees Israel has planted to hide its remains. Before engaging AlSalah's video in further depth, some context about the site after which it is named. Sorry, I think I have that. There it is. After which it is named is needed. Canada Park is located to the north and the west of Jerusalem in a strategic area formerly known as the Latrun Salient that Israel failed to conquer in 1948 but seized during the June 1967 war. Meeting no resistance, the Israeli army occupied 3 villages in Latrun, Emwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba, expelled several thousand Palestinian inhabitants, and forced them to walk roughly 30 kilometers to Ramallah without food or water. Following orders from then Commander-in-Chief Yitzhak Rabin, it demolished hundreds of homes in each village to prevent their inhabitants from ever returning. Soon after, the Mevo Haron settlement was erected atop the ruins of Beit Nuba, while Canada Park was established over the remains of Emwas and Yalo. Built by the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, which has planted millions of pine trees and other non-indigenous species over scores of destroyed and depopulated Palestinian villages, Canada Park is so named because the JNF's Canadian branch funded it with roughly $15 million, equivalent to about $100 million today in donations. The expulsion and erasure of Palestinian life around Latrun and the JNF's erasure of that erasure echo similar stories from 1948. Indeed, many of the refugees of Latrun had been forced to flee their homes 2 decades prior. If there's anything exceptional about this episode of ethnic cleansing, it is that Canada Park's land lies beyond the so-called Green Line, unbeknownst to most Israeli and international visitors, and has been effectively annexed by Israel. Thus, when Palestinians from the 3 destroyed villages, together with members of Zochrot, undertook a procession of return in summer 2007 to mark 40 years since their expulsion, the separation wall cut them off from Canada Park, even as they stood near the Mevo Haron settlements, even though the land on both sides of the wall is the West Bank. In addition to organizing this march, Zochrot campaigned to have signs erected within Canada Park that would testify to the histories of Emwas and Yalo. Following a long legal process, Zochrot compelled the JNF to erect 2 signs that acknowledge the existence of the 2 Palestinian villages, quote, until 1967, end quote. However, these did not so much as mention the events of that year or use the words occupation, expulsion, or refugees. Within weeks, 1 sign was removed and another defaced and subsequently removed. Canada Park incorporates images of the return mark organized by Zochrot, showing masses of people holding Palestinian flags and protest signs emblazoned with the names of the 3 villages. But AlSalah's aims as an artist and an exiled Palestinian are distinct from the documentary exposure of the village's histories that Zochrot undertakes largely to raise critical awareness among an Israeli public. Canada Park is not expository. Its images do not uncover a hidden truth, but blur, enlarge, juxtapose, and glitch motley visual layers as the artist drops into various street views within and perspectives of Canada Park offered by Google Maps and its affiliated user data. Photographs of the return march are themselves presented as one layer among others, digitally faded, recolored, and superimposed over the virtual Canada Park landscape. An image of a protest sign from the march, which reads, "We will not concede to the erasure of our villages, Emwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba," is the only explicit allusion to the destroyed Palestinian villages. By contrast, AlSalah's voiceover consists of first-person poetic phrases that perform the artist's spectral digital presence in Palestine as they evoke a psychic and political reality concealed by Canada Park and amplified by the alternately eerie and entrancing soundtrack by Nabiha Iqbal. The aforementioned line, "Ainiya taksir," translated interestingly into "My eye is a glass prism," repeats at least 3 times in the video, alongside other statements beginning "Aini" that name refusals, both sensory and political. "My eye has no tears to feed the monstrous pines." These accompany the artist's distortions of Google Street View imagery of Canada Park, subverting the notion of the software as a transparent window onto the world. Early in the video, the park's pine forests appear to melt away into abstraction as the artist manipulates the digital imagery into overexposed contours of dark green and white. Do I have that? Yeah, here. Dissolving and reconstructing images of the monstrous pines, the artist identifies her defiant, tearless eye with a decolonial I, as in the letter or pronoun I, as her voiceover continues, quote, "I'm not the public, I'm the undercommons." Both critically reflexive and surrealist in exploration of space, Canada Park substitutes psychogeography for cartography. As if on a situationist derive, AlSalah rejects an algorithmically efficient path for a set of disorienting movements and defamiliarizing perspectives, carving out spaces that elude those mapped by the Google software she employs. Rather than heighten the immersive quality of a virtual visit to Canada Park through spatiotemporal continuity, that is, by recording click-by-click movements along routes with clear imagery and ample information, AlSalah cuts across distinct user perspectives and discontinuous spaces while foregrounding processes of mediation that structure both Google's mapping software and her own video. If immersive VR offers users the illusion of access, proximity, and presence, Canada Park continually emphasizes partiality, distance, and absence. The video's opening glimpse of an informational sign in Hebrew, for example, is too brief to situate the park geographically, historically, or cinematically. The artist quickly tilts upwards to the sky and circles amid the blur of sunlight and clouds, as if searching for a space beyond the mapped reality. When the view tilts back to ground level, we see a tourist bus, the road in front of it, and the emblematic X and arrow icons that designate where the Google Street View user stands and where she can move. The arrow is then seen superimposed on the helmet of a bike rider whose blurry, jolted movements we follow and then abandon. These opening images both establish the contemporary functions of the national park, tourism, and leisure, and gesture at evading them, suggesting a user resistant to the software she employs as much as the site she explores. And I'm going to stop sharing this for a moment so I can play a clip. I apologize, we tried to get this full screen before, but that did not work. So we're gonna watch it slightly smaller screen. This will be a 2-minute clip from about halfway through the 8-minute video. Okay, I'll pause there and move back into the presentation. One moment. Imagining Palestinian return, AlSalah suggests, requires way, sorry, the closed captioning always comes on, requires ways of sensing that are foreclosed by the visuality of Google's platforms. Despite the avowedly apolitical character of Google Maps or Google Street View, these tools are not neutral, but rather reproduce the divisions and hierarchies of a settler colonial reality, not unlike 19th century and early 20th century photographs of the Holy Land that bolstered an imperial imaginary, rendering Palestinians absent or mere objects in the background of a biblical landscape. AlSalah highlights this as she visualizes the human icon on Google Street View hopping across landmarks within Canada Park like Cave and Roman Bath to Emmaus Nicopolis, a touristic site whose signposted Roman structures, together with signposted stories of a reincarnated Jesus walking, eclipses the unmarked remains of the Palestinian village Emwas. Paradoxically, AlSalah continually employs Google's mapping software to critique its naturalization of colonial power. AlSalah's previous video, Your Father Was Born 100 Years Old and So Was the Nakba, made in 2017, also employs Google Street View to digitally return to Palestine while underscoring the platform's ideological limits. For Your Father Was Born, the artist simulates a walk through the Haifa neighborhood from which her grandmother was displaced. Layering Google Street View with photographs of the pre-Nakba Palestinian city, she performs a spatiotemporal return to a Haifa whose buildings and street names have changed, in an extended allusion to Kanafani's returning to Haifa that the artist underscores by closely paraphrasing it with the quote, "I can't even see it, they're showing it to me," end quote. Where Kanafani referred to the opening of the Mandelbaum Gate directly after the June 1967 war, in AlSalah's video, it comes to suggest the appearance of Haifa via Google as an Israeli city. Canada Park is distinct from AlSalah's previous work with Google mapping software, however, in at least two respects. First, in addition to performing a virtual return for the diasporic artist, it also visually represents a collective march of return by Palestinian refugees to the destroyed villages from which they were expelled. In so doing, it disrupts the virtual sphere she uses, with images documenting a material practice of return by Palestinians living under occupation. Second, it reflects on the artist's own implication in settler colonial processes, with the choice of Canada Park as site and subject through which AlSalah thematizes the similar settler colonial histories that have displaced her ancestors and those of the people whose land she occupies as an artist living in Montreal. Quote, "I find myself on unceded Indigenous territory in so-called Canada, an exile unable to return to Palestine," end quote, AlSalah writes. Her statement helpfully explicates the video by providing some of the political context to which it alludes, but it also poetically complements the video as much as it describes it. Opening with the surreal assertion, "I walk on snow to fall onto the desert," AlSalah performs a collapse of time and space that dramatizes the political proximity of the two geographically far-flung settler states as she virtually transports herself to a home that is no longer home. Quote, "I trespass the colonial border as a digital specter floating through Ayalon Canada Park, transplanted over 3 Palestinian villages razed by the Israeli occupation forces in 1967, end quote. By concluding Canada Park in present-day Canada, AlSalah refuses a unidirectional critique or a focus on her digital return to Palestine that would conceal her embodied location on unceded Indigenous territory in so-called Canada, in her words. Indeed, the scene features a body, for the first time in a video constructed through screen captures of Google Street Views, standing on a snowy hill at a distance between two communications towers, as if visualizing the artist's position both here and there within a settler colonial network. Here, the figure starts to clap her hands and dance as the voiceover concludes, "My eye has no lid to close for prayer. My eye is a glass prism, an incantation for rain," and the sounds of a traditional Arabic song emerge from the electronic soundtrack. The camera zooms in on her during this rain dance, but she does not come into focus. Instead, her dark coat fractures into kinetic pixels, dissolving the snowy scene into black and white abstraction until a view of the Canada Park desert fades in behind the pixels. Canada Park concludes with this evocation of an interconnected settler colonial present and an invocation through dance and haptic imagery of the power to bring about another future. I've been emphasizing return as a structure continually imagined and performed by Palestinians. Even within this framework, Ghaz's Great March of Return stands as an extraordinary demonstration of collective will and political refusal. Having lived under a brutal siege for more than a decade, tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza performed the lethal act of converging on a heavily guarded border fence as if returning to their homes, though they understood that debility or death likely awaited them. Like countless other practices of return from 48 to the present, the Great March of Return both asserts the ongoing reality of Palestine as a nation not bounded by the borders imposed on it, and renews return as an urgent right that exceeds its legal framework in UN Resolution 194. Abou-Rahme and Abbas's At Those Terrifying Frontiers represents Palestinians who participated in Ghaz's Great March of Return through avatars generated from their images and from the artist's own bodily movements. Abstracted into virtual but still expressive and mobile human figures, the avatars appear 1, 2, 3, or 4 at a time, framed in tight squares or vertical rectangles with cell phone camera features at their bottom, as if confined in or trying to escape their visual mediations. These frames are superimposed over images of fields, mountains, and roads, or on black screens across which the artist's signature bold on-screen text flashes. Gaza, the Great March of Return, and its violent repression are not visualized, effectively reframing a dehistoricized media focus on climactic violence to address a broader history of Palestinian aspiration and action, even an ontology of the Palestinian condition. The artist's sample text from Edward Said's 1986 book, After the Last Sky, Palestinian Lives, a collaboration with the photographer Jean Maure, in which Said's reflections on Palestinian subjectivity complement and address Maure's images of daily life in a range of Palestinian locales across historic Palestine, as well as refugee camps in the region. Through the artist's acts of sampling, remediation, and performance, At Those Terrifying Frontiers transmutes Said's poetic text into a mournful song sung by these avatars, creating a virtual trans-historical collectivity that reflects on what it is to be Palestinian, to be uprooted from one's land and way of life, and to dream of returning home. Abbas and Abou-Rahme conceived of At Those Terrifying Frontiers in the early weeks of the Great March of Return while working in Ramallah. The West Bank city is roughly 50 kilometers away from the northern Gaza Strip, but this short distance is unbridgeable, even more so for one of the two artists who is unable, because of their ID, to enter Jerusalem even. Unable to approach, let alone enter Gaza, the artist witnessed the march from a mediated distance. The project began then as a, quote, effort to break this forced separation, in the artist's words. Abbas and Abou-Rahme collected images of Palestinians participating in the march taken by Palestinian protesters and photojournalists in Gaza. Subsequently, they input these images into software that generated three-dimensional human figures from the images, abstracting their features and enabling the artists to smooth the texture of their skin, reconstruct or remove the hair, and place them in simple monochrome t-shirts. The Palestinian returnees become anonymous avatars, shedding their individual identities, but they remain expressive in their poses, gazes, gestures, and wounds. In the process of rendering, missing data produced blurry deformations that appear as bruises and cuts, glitches that evoke the injuries suffered by the Palestinian demonstrators. To animate the avatars, Abbas and Abou-Rahme recorded themselves reenacting gestures they witnessed in footage of the march. After feeding video of their performance to the software, the avatars adopted the movements of the two artists and some of their distinct facial features. In this process of, quote, disembodiment and re-embodiment, the artists merged with the protesters they could not join, making themselves present affectively and virtually through the rendering of the avatars. Abbas and Abou-Rahme generate proximity to Gaza outside the logics of humanitarian optics and violent spectacles. To bridge the distance to Gaza for themselves and their viewers, the artists digitally mediate and remediate their embodied performance. But far from hiding these processes of mediation to present an immersive sense of being there, they puncture the illusion of proximity with cuts, glitches, and delays. Virtuality is not here about the poignant simulation of presence at a distant site of conflict. Abbas and Abou-Rahme counter both in aesthetics of mediation and the illusion of immersion. Rather than expose victimized Palestinians to spectators, they intimate oblique elements of Palestinian struggles to shape their own identity, image, and narrative. In the artist's practice, the cut emerges as a key gesture against mediation and immersion. This includes the cut in the cinematic sense of montage, as the artists dispense with continuities of space and time through their editing. A logic of the cut is also emphasized in the artist's installations, for which images are often projected across multiple surfaces, interrupting their wholeness and rupturing the gestalt of figures such as, for example, a human face or a body. Similar fragmentation occurs through their use of screens within screens, which emphasizes the partiality of any mediation, both through the interrupted image and the suggestion of simultaneous planes of action. In the artist's words, quote, "Our practice makes the thread between different times, spaces, and imaginaries visible," end quote. This simultaneously connective and disjunctive logic emerges in At Those Terrifying Frontiers, which here I'm showing a few installation shots so you can see how it would be shown in a moment. I'll show the video in a very, very partial sense as a partial screen video online on eFlux's website. This simultaneously connective and disjunctive logic emerges in At Those Terrifying Frontiers in its visualizations of impossible conjunctions between the West Bank and Gaza, and in the resonances and translations between its sources and the audiovisual forms that they take. And now I'll play about a minute and a half of this video. So now I start sharing again. تلك هي الحدود المرعبة التي تفرض علينا أن نكون كي نكون أحرار. حيث المقاومة ملحة ويكبر الوعي بالحاجة إلى معرفة غير مألوفة وغير معقولة. نتنفس في مكان لا يسمح لنا لكي نتنفس في مكان لا يسمح لنا أن نرى الآن نحن عليه الفاني Okay, and so as mentioned earlier, the video is constructed around sampled phrases from Said's poetic meditation on Palestinian subjectivity, which the artists sing in Arabic, having translated excerpts of the text themselves, as the original English text flashes on screen in short lines synchronized with their vocals. Over the course of 10 minutes, they sing and intone separately and together in solemn, lamenting, and at times declarative cadences. Their words resound as they are both swallowed and amplified by heavy reverb, often looped to generate echoes and grooves, and sometimes interrupted by effects that produce noisy stutters. Produced with the dense sonic layering common to the artist's videos, the complex soundscape conveys as much as the lyrics. It is also distinctly and disarmingly personal as the artist's only video to date that features their own voices. After the Last Sky likewise marked a departure for Said, a personal reflection that was then a far cry from the scholar's typically assertive argumentation. It is an inward-looking book, full of doubt, melancholy, and vulnerability. These qualities emerge in large part from Said's collaboration with the Swiss photographer Jean Mort, to whom Said was introduced by their mutual friend John Berger. After the Last Sky is Said's response to the intimate photographs that Moore took during visits to Palestine, Israel, and Palestinian refugee camps in the region in the late 70s and early 80s, during which he documented quotidian Palestinian experiences in streets, markets, schools, and domestic spaces. Said's text focuses on questions of how to represent Palestinians in this context, how to narrate the Palestinian condition to a world steeped in negations of Palestinian identity, not to mention in the shadow of disappeared archives and across the social fragmentations imposed by Israel. The first words the artists cite from Said's book announce these themes. We have experienced a great deal that has not been recorded. Many of us have been killed, many permanently scarred and silenced without a trace, and the images used to represent us only diminish our reality further. In these lines, distinct forms of violence converge to convey Palestinian existence as threatened by physical force, by representation in images, and by the absence of representation, has not been recorded. Said takes the book's title from a well-known Mahmoud Darwish poem, using as its epigraph the couplet, "Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where can the birds fly after the last sky?" If Darwish's poem is a classic expression of Palestinian displacement and dispossession, of spatial and spiritual confinement, Said plumbs these themes further, but adds the sense of being confined by images and narratives of one's identity. The artists translate this confinement visually, at times circumscribing the avatar's images with tight frames as if to ask, what frames are capacious enough to hold and to transmit Palestinian experience? Which frames do not bring Palestinian life closer, but contain it? Is visibility a trap? Or, as Said asks, can we see what we are? Have we really seen what we have seen? These are some of the questions the artists take up as they grapple with the question of how to bear witness and mediate that witnessing to a world saturated with images of violence. As mentioned previously, Razan does not appear in this video, nor do images of tear gas, burning tires, or bloodied bodies. The artists show a few fleeting nighttime views of border fences in the West Bank that evoke a sense of incarceration shared by Palestinians living under occupation. Other than these images, however, there's only a general sense of place, as the avatars are superimposed over monochrome screens, fields of thistle, and mountainous landscapes. In light of the vocal soundtrack, sung in the style of an Islamic nasheed or chant, it is as if the avatars are lifted into a spiritual plane. This sense is heightened by following the gazes of the avatar as they look upward or into the distance, perhaps at the viewer or through them. But this spiritual quality is not deliverance. It is imbued with doubt and yearning that registers across image, text, and sound. When Said wrote After the Last Sky in 85 and 86, he had not been to Palestine since his family fled Jerusalem in 47 under the duress of Zionist and British fighting. It was not until 1992, after he had resigned from the Palestinian National Council, that he was able to return to Palestine 45 years after his family's exodus. Until then, he notes, it was photographs like Moore's that brought him closest to imagining everyday life in Jerusalem, Gaza, Nablus, or Hebron. In this sense, After the Last Sky itself marks a virtual return before the event of the author's individual return, before the return of thousands of PLO members that followed the Oslo Accords, and before the collective return that Palestinians insist will come. Toward its end, At Those Terrifying Frontiers visualizes avatars within the frame of smartphone screens superimposed over night skies and mountainous landscapes. The avatars join the artists on the road in the West Bank, evoking a sense of virtual return for these marchers who are not able to cross the border fence. But of course, the West Bank too is occupied, and the artists and protesters can only reach one another through their virtual merging, so the enforced separation remains. For now, it can only be transcended through virtuality, which, as I suggest, does not imply high-tech immersion in a simulated reality or escape into unreality, but something closer to emergence, a combination of actuality and potentiality, of what is and what could be. What is are ongoing practices of Palestinian samud and resistance, holding steadfast on one's land and rehearsing return. What is, in other words, is the ongoing effort to come home that is halted within 48 by army demolitions and arrests, and in Gaza by being tear-gassed and shot down. What could be is a return like the one visualized as the avatars become unmoored from Gaza's siege and are lifted virtually into spaces from which they might return home. Abou-Rahme and Abbas forge a multi-sensory, embodied form of witnessing that opens onto this potentiality that can be felt but is only fleetingly glimpsed, that is immanent in the here and now, but rarely visualized. It is in these opaque openings that the Palestinian condition can emerge as a struggle for freedom that invites not humanitarian sympathy, but political solidarity, on the basis not of Palestinians' identities as victims, but of our collective becoming at those terrifying frontiers where the existence and disappearance of peoples fade into each other. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kareem. And yeah, I'll just thanks again, and I'll hand over to Kay for the response. Thanks, Kay.
Thanks. And no, thank you. That was like a really beautifully written presentation with this really sort of deft conjoining of historical precedents of both return and its artistic representation and mediation, and I very much appreciated that broader history that you brought to us. So I don't want to take up too much space. I'll try not to. Ultimately, I think I'm here to give people a little bit of thinking time. So I hope everyone's kind of cogitating as I continue. I'm going to limit myself to 2 questions. One of them is quite specific and small, and you might just go, I haven't thought of that. And another is much broader and concerned actually with the role of academics within contexts like these. So that's a big question that I think we'll answer together for many years to come. So the niche one is about plants. And I was noticing, having watched both works quite regularly actually for the last, since they've come out, that they're in very different ways. They use plants as signifiers of indigeneity. Mm-hmm. In Terrifying Frontiers, there's this repeat footage, and we're used to this from Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work of using footage. I think I can't even remember where I first saw it, but you see these close-ups of thistles and different kinds of plants, and as if to sort of suggest a sheer vitality of what we find when we visit these places. Mm-hmm. Conversely, Saleh's recording of Canada Park includes these really like non-native pine trees, and they're trees that symbolize Canada in one way, but also are very much part of a very sort of, like, say, profoundly symbiotic and spiritually resonant for First Peoples of those lands, and whom Saleh is very much aligning with the Palestinian struggle. So I'm just sort of wondering if there's any way to undo the colonial projects of botany as they get fashioned with this kind of Jewish national funds multifarious insistences on the nation state within that geography. And I'm wondering what potential for you lies in that kind of intermesh of the really, really organic and the digital. So that's question one. I will continue with question two, so you can make your choice or just ignore both. But like I say, this one's not for us alone. I hope you can answer it, but it's a sort of stickler for us. But it concerns the role, as I said, of academics, both in relation to works like this and more broadly within the context of return. So all three of these artists I find to be highly intellectual. We've got Said, another intellectual, like as the anchor to Abbas and Abou-Rahme's project. Razan AlSalah teaches in a university. So these are people who very much speak our languages. I'm making assumptions about who's in the Zoom call here. So then I think to myself, how can we open up our own specific capacities, perhaps as academics, to bring to light, well, more than just bring to light what these works are doing, because these are artists who are immensely articulate in their practice and frequently well versed in exactly the sorts of writings we might bring to bear upon them as analysts. So what to do with that? And your presentation struck me as deeply in solidarity with the work they're doing and using those registers in that way. Obviously, nothing like the immediation or the short-circuiting around loss that you discussed in the beginning. Not at all kind of concerned with this futile sense of trying to evoke humanity or a humanitarian voice. But then, how do we, as researchers, aspire to something more than being a kind of bystander in solidarity with at these moments as commentators? Edward Said does give us this, kind of a glimpse of how that might be manifest but he's a very special case, clearly, in what he the roles he assumed throughout his life. To use the kind of phrasing of Abou-Rahme and Abbas, what might our cut be as thinkers around their work? Or to take your own words, what, from the closing moments of your presentation, and maybe to invite you to think about as a starting rather than an endpoint, what is the could be that we might kind of involve ourselves in as thinkers? What might an academic critical writing of rather than on return look like? So that's me. Thank you so much. I loved it. I love the work you're drawing on, and I really love what you're doing with it. So enormous appreciation from this end.
Thank you so much, Kay. Those are really generous and thoughtful comments. And yeah, I'm torn between addressing the first because there's a specificity to it that, anchors me and that I can speak to in a certain way. And the second, because it's urgent and because I'm always thinking about this, and yet I don't have a fully satisfactory response. So so where to begin? Maybe with the first, just to have something a little bit more knowable, concrete at first, and also to maybe say that I think that specifically this thinking around plants, because of the intersecting urgencies of Palestine and of climate collapse at the moment, maybe helps, if even part of a suggestion to the second question, which is about intersecting campaigns of social justice as well as intersecting crises in a certain way. So to say that also something that we can do as academics is always be working with frames in such a way that even as we're writing with people who maybe think like us and have similar politics and solidarities, that in the ways that we build communities as academics too, we can help some of those works enter into conversation with, say, artists, activists, academics who are working on indigenous struggles around the world, on climate struggles around the world, and so on. But to move back to the first question, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's notable that in a way, thistle and you know, specifically a lot of forbidden plants that are forbidden for foraging, like akub and za'atar, come up as images in Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work often, because these are also glimpses of what exceeds, I think, the frame of images that are typically in news media about Palestinians and about Palestine, Israel. So there's a suggestion, I think, as you were saying, that encountering that kind of life that is, you know, sort of, it has this complex relationship to the idea of digital capture or photographic capture, does something to our desire for a different kind of relationship to the image and to the land, and maybe that has something to suggest for, yeah, a thinking around politics beyond an image of a kind of tired image of the human at the moment in some way. Of course, there are works specifically dealing with this, like Jumana Mana's Foragers film, Vivian Sansour's project around seeds, and yeah, many others taking this on more directly. But it's really interesting to see, to hear you note this comparison, because I actually hadn't thought about the distinct resonance of the pine tree within First Nations communities, and how it can be something other than a symbol of the kind of, yeah, JNF importation of European forestry to obfuscate erasure and ethnic cleansing. So yeah, I mean, I think that in a way I'm torn between the two questions clearly, and so I sort of was answering one while thinking about the other, and it's something that I find a challenge from a couple different perspectives. One, of course, the difficulty in the first place that often some of these works have harder time finding exhibition space within Palestine than in the rest of the world. Of course, there are a few, you know, whether it's like the Khalil Sakakini Center, or it's like a couple art venues or film venues where they'll find a place in Palestine. But what does it mean for this work to exist primarily not for Palestinian viewership, at least within historic Palestine? And then also our role in a kind of unmarked way as academics. For me, I think a lot also about my role as someone who is of Palestinian origin, but also really has existed more in, you know, Western academic spaces and cultural spaces broadly. And so what is the role of translation or mediation in that sense, in a couple directions? So I'm just asking questions. I don't really know answers to your great questions there, but maybe now that we've thought about that a little bit together, it opens it up to other questions or answers from the audience, because I see that that's pouring in. And thanks again.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Kay, and thanks, Kareem, for your response as well. Yeah, so if anybody in the room has got a question, I see Bernadette. If you have a question, if you'd like to.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for that wonderful presentation, Kareem, and also for your very thoughtful response to it, Kay, as well. I'm Bernadette Buckley. I'm the convener of the MA Art and Politics at Goldsmiths, just to put in context who I am, where I come from. And I have, with my students, been looking at quite a bit of Palestinian art over the years. And I was very struck by what you said at the end of the presentation about this kind of marriage between actuality and potentiality in Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about this potential marriage between the two being a characteristic of Palestinian art more broadly, because I was thinking of somebody like Kayla Jarrar's State of Palestine, for instance, which was a piece that was discussed very widely in the West, not least because it coincided with the Picasso in Palestine exhibition, and Zizek, of course, had his passport stamped, and so everybody heard about the piece. But it seemed to me that one of the things that was very successful about that piece was precisely that it used art to kind of make this connection between something that was a potential and to actualize it, at least at the level of a kind of diasporic experience, and that it also enacted this kind of sense of a potential return. So I wondered if you could maybe say something about that. And secondly, to ride again off Kay's question about the academic response as well. I mean, I don't know how tuned in to the art world in Berlin you are, but you may have heard of the kind of shenanigans that have been going on in Documenta last year. And it seems to me that being a bystander, as it were, is not a simple act at all. And, you know, Adam Broomberg is the artist and academic whose situation sort of speaks most loudly, I think, to some of us in the UK. You know, simply expressing support for the BDS movement, simply making a comparison between apartheid in South Africa and the Palestinian situation. He is rounded on by Hamburg's anti-Semitism commissioner and condemned, not just for his support of BDS, but also is called an anti-Semite. And so it seems to me that, you know, even expressing solidarity from an academic or an artistic position is actually very complicated. And in a sense, you're there in the front lines already. So I just wondered if you could respond to either or both of these questions. Thanks. You.
Yeah, again, two excellent questions that I sort of have to navigate dealing with both or one. But so for the first one, that's a very interesting comparison with Khaled Jarrar's work, and something that I would, as you're saying that, what it makes me think about is, in a way, you know, Palestinian artists' ambivalence towards documentary frameworks broadly, and how in bearing witness to conditions that are not believed, that when Palestinians speak to them, they're told that they're anti-Semitic. To, you know, switch over to your second question for a moment, there, you know, has been a strong documentary impulse that goes back to, in thinking about moving image works, certainly the work of the Palestine Film Unit, which is, you know, some of the first moving image works produced by Palestinians were in these sort of Palestinian party produced and sponsored films made from the late 60s to the early 80s that were all documentaries. And of course, documentary also really undergirds a lot of the sort of Second Intifada era films that have to do with checkpoints, limited mobility, the construction of the separation wall, and so on. And so there's a real strong sense to wanting, you know, this actuality of occupation and of ongoing colonization to be part of the visual language, I think, that Palestinians have recourse to, at the same time that increasingly, I think, in the post-Oslo and then post-Second Intifada period, Palestinian artists felt that, you know, images of brutality, even as they pointed to structural conditions and not just to, you know, sort of victims in the humanitarian way that I was speaking out about a bit in my talk, that even so, they were not impacting an international audience in a certain way, or also were feeling like they were entirely directed to, say, international human rights festival sorts of audience, or a very, very limited and elite audiences in certain ways, while also not speaking to kind of Palestinian feeling at a structural level, like the way that a time and place and a way of existing feels. And so I think that the combination of actuality and potentiality, however one sees it, is partly this being torn between wanting to bear witness to, the ongoing Nakba, and wanting to also be true to the ongoing aspirations and practices of hope and of struggle that that Palestinians have always held on to. And part of that is a creative, even a futurist imaginary. Part of it is also a kind of playfulness at different moments, but always I think that tension or that combination is important. Yeah, and on the second part, I mean, I take what you're saying as a good reminder that even if we're only, in some ways, remediating what artists and activists within Palestine, or what other artists such as AlSalah or Abbas and Abou-Rahme are saying, where powerful bodies perceive danger, if we are in some ways upsetting them, then it's doing something. So there's that. And yeah, Germany finds itself at the center of a lot of this today as a fascinating and disturbing site in which Palestinians are increasingly subcontracted, to use one of my colleagues' terms, the new book, wonderful, called Subcontractors of Guilt, about the use of Muslims within Germany to basically take on the burden of Holocaust memory. This is a new book on Stanford by Esra Öztürk. Germany is a unique and disturbing place for the ways that it is supposedly upholding the pride of its Holocaust memory, but largely by controlling the way that memory is channeled, and naming both leftist and anti-Zionist Jews, as well as Palestinians and Arabs and any Palestine activists, as anti-Semites for various acts of what Michael Rothberg would call multi-directional memory, that keep in mind both Palestinian suffering today and a history of both Jewish suffering as well as Jewish dissent, that refuses to see Palestinians as the perpetrators of that suffering.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just very briefly come back, I mean, because there was a recent case actually in the UK as well of an artist who was commissioned to do a piece of work which was situated in the front of a children's hospital in London. I don't know if other people have come across this example, and these were basically a series of plates which were decorated by drawings by Palestinian children, and the piece was removed after a lobby by, I think it was Lawyers for Israel. So much as though I would like to say, this is Germany's particular issue here, we've actually had quite a lot of discussions in this country as well, where the term anti-Semitism has been used in a very hostile way, I just, I wonder if this is evidence of a growing escalation in the temperature around this argument, or perhaps not, I don't know. Perhaps other people have something more to say about that. I mean, I personally found that example really shocking because the images were so banal and so, unexceptional in any way, and actually, they were the kind of images that children anywhere in the world would make. So weaponizing them in this way just seemed incredibly to just be a very aggressive act.
Yeah, I won't go too much into that since I only sort of know the details of this one, but just to say, yeah, I don't want to singularly, point out Germany as the only perpetrator here. And of course, all of this has been longstanding in the United States, where I'm from. So yes, Germany has some particular characteristics that we can note, particularly in relationship to Documenta and to other examples recently. But of course, it's widespread. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you.
So anyone else with any other questions or? Well, Kareem, maybe I could ask while people are perhaps still thinking. Yeah, I was curious. I guess kind of related to the overall framing of the kind of research lab that is at Warwick. This kind of the way in which this work in a certain way responds to or kind of operates against the tendency of this kind of forensic media culture and an idea of a particular kind of articulation of a truth that seems to kind of be like restabilized in a certain sense, or is a particular kind of idea of a kind of ocular-centric truth that kind of maybe restructures quite problematically, I think, kind of like conservative ideas around kind of like I guess like justice or humanitarianism as well, more broadly. So I just wondered if maybe if that kind of plugs into your kind of wider thinking around this, particularly as some of the much of this forensic media work deals with the Palestinian context as well. So perhaps if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I do. I guess I think about it a little bit more in my own work through a kind of turn away from the archive as a site in which truth is produced and accountability, in some sense, guaranteed or promised. To think a lot about how Palestinians have, for decades testified to the violence that has been done to them, but those testimonies have been deemed in various ways hearsay, unreliable oral history, and so on, against the kind of documentary authority that Israel has, both by way of its kind of proximity to Europeanness or to whiteness, in terms of the reliability of its own speakers, as well as the written form, the evidentiary forms that it has by way of having state archives and institutions, and recognizably powerful sort of guarantors of truth that are built in large part through the dispossession of Palestinian papers and documents, right? So that Palestinians don't have those to rely upon, because at many, many moments of Palestinian history, they have been stolen as an explicit part of a project of cultural erasure, whether it's in Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 82, or it's in 48, or it's at various moments where there was mass plunder of papers, specifically. So I think that the artists, these two artists and others that I look at, it's not that there's necessarily a kind of opposition to me at the level of like trust in visuality or forensics at that level, but with a discourse of verifiability or of the authority of facts in a certain way. One could think about Abbas and Abou-Rahme, another video of theirs called Only the Beloved Keeps Our Secrets, which, if I'm remembering which one correctly, is about a young boy, a teenager, who snuck underneath a border fence to pick akub, the plant we were discussing earlier, and was shot and killed by an Israeli soldier. And for a moment, they use surveillance footage within the video that records that act of killing, but it's really just a passing sort of image, and it's not of the killing itself. It's not something that would, you know, show in a legally significant way what happened. And they end up focusing much more on, you know, on the akub plant, as well as other symbols of Palestinian song and folklore, like the moon and other natural imagery. And, you know, you could sort of contrast that with, say, a work by Lawrence Abu Hamdan that focuses on the Nakba Day shooting of 2 Palestinian teenagers, but is reconstructing that moment. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's just a kind of turn away from the contestatory space of evidence and accountability because of a distrust in the systems that would guarantee those things, you know, at a political but also aesthetic or intellectual level, you could say, too, in terms of historiography and regimes of documentary. So yeah, that's the response.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for that question.
That's okay. Yeah, wondering if there's any other kind of questions from the room, if there's any final thoughts. I think our numbers are going down around 6:30, so I guess that makes sense around this kind of time of day. But if anyone's got any kind of final things that they'd like to bring up or bring in. Okay, well, Kareem, thanks so much, and Kay, thanks so much as well. Yeah, this was really great, and we'll have some more events upcoming with the Emergent Nonfiction Lab. But yeah, just to really thank you, Kareem and Kay, for your response as well. And yeah,
thank you.
Goodbye.
Both.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Noel.